Hello, everybody. I'm your host, Josh the Archon, and tonight we're having a fantastic conversation based on miracles. And we'll delve right into that soon as possible. But first, I want to thank everybody who's within the comment section at this very moment. Thank you so much for coming on through and listening in and really just hearing what the Atheist Uprising is bringing forward. So, again, thank you, fellow commenter or viewer. Thank you very much. The next thing that I would like to say is thanks to our Patreon supporters. I would like to thank Linear and TART for helping me do what I'm doing and doing something that I love, which is bestowing information onto you, the viewer, and also having great conversations in and of themselves, because I think that is something that is beneficial for everybody, is to have fruitful discussions about sometimes serious topic matters and other times not that serious topic matter. But anyways, let's get into the show. Tonight, I really want to thank and really want to welcome onto the show two reoccurring guests. One, Scott Williamson. Scott Williamson, welcome back to the show. Thank you for coming on.
No problem, man. Thanks for having me.
That's right. Thank you for coming on. I greatly appreciate it. And Bryce Aroni. Bryce Aroni, thank you for coming on the show again. It is an honor and a privilege. I can't speak now. Privilege to have you both on.
I'm glad that you chose that word instead of something else.
Right.
Yeah, I'm happy to be back.
Right. So, before we get started, I know that you're reoccurring guests, but I just want, if anybody is their first time coming on here or listening into this, maybe just give a quick introduction of who you are so that our commenters or viewers can understand that, and after we can delve right into the topic matter at hand. So whoever wishes to go first, either Bryce Aroni or Scott Williamson.
Okay. Yeah, I'll make it quick because I'm Scott Williamson. I'm hosting two other channels on my own. Special shout out to Sophia. We have a show called Conservative Principles with Scott and Sophia. So we just talk about politics a little bit on that channel. And on my other channel is about music, where I'm interviewing, some of the legends and pioneers of electro and hip hop music. So those are the two things I kind of do and kind of known about in the YouTube world, at least a tiny bit. So that's what I'm doing now. So other than that, I'm an atheist. Used to be religious, and you can hear about my story on last week's show.
Yes, it was a great show last week. And plus, in the descriptions below, we have both shows. We have Electro Live, and we have Conservative Principles down below. All right, and Bryce Aroni.
I am Bryce Aroni. I also am a I'm a current atheist who used to be a believer. I think most of your audience probably knows me, but for the few who don't, I am a part-time contributor over at Skeptic Haven on a little show called Secular Soapbox. And I do plan on getting back there, but it's been a while since I've done anything. And I also have you may know me from another show called The Bryce is Right, which is on hiatus at the moment. But those are the two most prominent online things that people might know me from. And other than that, I'm just a guy who occasionally shows up on Facebook and Twitter to, talk smack. But
wonderful having you both on. So let's actually discuss at this very moment, what is miracles? For both of you, what do you think consists a miracle? What is a miracle in the first place?
Do you want to go, Scott?
Yeah, so
you look like you were primed to say something.
I hope I'm trying to be. So there's kind of like two ways that we can talk about it here. That's more popular, I guess. And there's if you go to a philosophical definition, you could go to Stanford's Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and it says that a miracle by definition is the most improbable of events the probability of a miracle is infinitesimally remote. So they kind of center on what it is. Christians have a kind of a different view, in my experience of talking to any Christian. What they'll say is that miracles always come from God. So they're not really remote unless God doesn't want to make them normal, which he doesn't. That's why we have a name for it called miracle. It means something that's out of the norm, can't be explained. It's kind of like magic. And so God, does this magical thing and interferes with the laws of nature, like raising people from the dead, or, causing the Red Sea to split so they can run away from Pharaoh, whatever. And so those are the two things that, as I understand, the definitions are anyways.
Yeah. And I would, first of all, usually when I am trying to find out what we're talking about, whatever the discussion is, I always look up the relevant word, which is miracle. But I tend to shy away from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy unless I'm specifically looking for the philosophical definition, just because people don't talk that way, right? In normal everyday conversation, usually, like, if you ask the question, what is a miracle, they're probably not going to give you the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy definition. They're going to give you something closer to what's in the dictionary. And so I usually start there because I think that that's what most people are probably talking about. And when we look at it from that perspective, a miracle, like if you just Google it, it says that it's a surprising or welcome event that is not explicable by natural or scientific laws and is therefore considered to be the work of a divine agency. So that's kind of a combination of the two different philosophical definitions that Scott just gave, the colloquial usage. It's sort of like it's highly unusual and very rare and from God at the same time. And I think that's what most people are talking about when they say miracle, but it has other uses as well. It has other non-supernatural uses.
Right. I would completely agree with both usages of the term that both of you actually given. And I think the reality of the situation is that I think that a lot of people like to quote miracles as something that they don't necessarily understand, right? So if it's something that I don't know, henceforth that must be a miracle because I can't answer that. It's not necessarily nobody can answer that, is that I can't answer that. And henceforth, this is a miracle to me. So I think also a miracle is based on a person's perspective, in a sense, based on their knowledge of what is and what isn't.
Most people make conflation errors all the time. So they may not understand a term as it's used in philosophy versus religion. And they're just using it kind of in their
or
own
common
way.
Parlance.
Yeah, it's like, oh, when my baby was born, it was a miracle. Or, they're not really thinking of the philosophical usage of the word or anything like that. So it's kind of hard to tell what people mean. So usually if I'm talking to somebody about that, I just ask them, what do you mean by miracle? Because it can have so many different definitions. And then we can discuss whether it's probable to believe, or if there's a probable way to make it valid to believe in a miracle, because I think by definition, it's supposed to be anti-logic somehow. Like it's supposed to defy logic and defy explanation. And,
when you go to a hospital, oftentimes you'll hear, or if you watch a movie about hospitals and doctors and stuff, invariably something will happen where the doctor says, oh, his chances of recovery are like 10%, and then the guy recovers and he's like, we can't explain this, it's a miracle. And usually when they're doing that, they're not saying that God came down from heaven and did some sort of magic and healed through breaking the laws of physics. You know what I mean? Like they're not using it that way. They're just saying the chances were really low. It was unlikely and it happened. So that he beat the odds. So it's kind of a euphemism for, wow, he really beat the odds and we weren't expecting it. But religious people will turn around and use that to say, see, that's evidence of the divine. Well, that's not really what the doctor said.
Right, right. But I think that also shows, just like how Scott Williams stated, and even yourself, that kind of shows the person's, again, perspective based on the matter. Where sometimes if we're looking at the possibility of something happening and that possibility is extremely low, yet it happens nonetheless, that would have to, it will not have to, but individuals feel so much in awe by the circumstance that they say, well, this is a miracle type of thing, like this is something that didn't have a high probability of happening, and yet here we are.
They might as well say that about the winner of the lotto Powerball.
That is very true. That is very true.
Well, if you win the Powerball, it's a miracle, because what are the chances that would happen to you? But if someone wins the Powerball that's not you, it's not a miracle, because invariably there's 300 million people, somebody's going to win eventually. Like it's not 100% likelihood that someone will eventually win, but it's a high degree of probability. So you don't see it as a miracle when you're not the winner,
Right. I think I definitely agree with that. And I think that the usage of miracle is kind of thrown around relatively how could it, like, nonchalantly,
loosely.
It's kind of like, miracle, this happened. Oh, I found my keys, miracle. I found my wallet where I thought I lost it, miracle. It's kind of like using a different nuance, I guess, in different ways of speaking.
It is, and I think it's important. Go ahead. I'm gonna let you go. Scott.
Please jump in.
I just wanted to say, I think it's really important that when someone's using that word, you try to define your terms and figure out how they're using it, so that because I found my keys, it's a miracle. Well, that's not a miracle. God didn't necessarily do that. Well, that's not what I meant by that. After then, it's understood. But because we use it so loosely with everything, it's really important if you're going to speak to a religious person, especially, have them define miracle, and try to narrow it to some specific parameters that you can test for, and then that way you can see whether it's reasonable to believe or not. But because otherwise they could just equivocate. Look at what doctors say when he only had a 10% chance. It's a miracle,
Right.
Yeah, I had a conversation I think it was last week with a religious person who was saying that, trying to make the argument that miracles are possible. Or we're trying to shift the burden on me, like, how do you know miracles are impossible? How do you know that? Have you accounted for everything in reality that could make something that you don't understand come to pass? So basically, sometimes what they'll do is they'll try to be really rigorous with the logic and go really into these realms of not everyday parlance. Like, we don't think about things like that in our normal everyday thing. Like, if we saw, a man come to life after being dead for 3 days, we'd be like, I don't believe you. If someone told you that, they'd be like, I just don't believe that. But for some reason, they make this old book fallacy that because it's in an old book, it's true. But then they know that that's kind of bad argument. So they'll say, well, it's actually possible if you think about it, because you don't know. Like, there's no logical contradiction there, not really. There could be some special technology, like, they'll use, stories like when you go to lost civilizations, for example, and show them a cell phone. For them, that's a miracle,
I told you, Josh, I was literally having this conversation. That example was used.
Exactly. They always use that example, so it's like, well, then that's not a miracle, because you would also say the cell phone is not a miracle. So your analogy is just not equal.
Yeah. If you want to say, look, I think it was it Isaac Asimov who said any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.
Right.
This is how people in the science fiction realm and who are science inclined often think about magic and that usage, that it's part of nature, that there's nothing supernatural. Everything is part of nature, and we're just calling something magic because we don't understand the mechanism according to the laws of physics yet, But that is different from how it's used in religion, where if that's what it was, then that defeats the purpose, because that's within the laws of nature. That's not necessarily a violation. It's not God intervening to change
Right.
the laws of nature, which is the whole point of why it's forbidden. It's a forbidden art in the Bible because it's unnatural, So if you're gonna have a religious person say, well, no, it's part of nature, well, then you don't have a good argument for the supernatural now.
Right.
I'm happy to call magic part of nature, but why call it that? Why not just call it a mystery then? We already have
right. Because there are mysteries. Like, that's the thing. And I think that that's the question, though, because they think that, okay, well, because we don't know everything, henceforth that there's some sort of gap that can be utilized in the sense where, like, okay, since we don't know all there is to nature, the miracles in and of themselves can be something attributed by. Yeah, exactly.
Some unknown natural process or some advanced technology that we don't know about. You guys both watch Star Trek, or you're familiar with it. They have the transporter or whatever. They can make people appear and disappear. If we see that and we don't understand the process, it's magic. Even though it's not. From the perspective of the characters, it's technology, but we don't understand.
That's true. That's very true.
We don't understand.
And that's where I want to try to bring the conversation, though, because when we look at the biblical narrative, for instance, for miracles, we hear about, and definitely the biggest miracle is with Moses splitting the Red Sea, hitting the rock, which then creates.
I would disagree with that. I would say the biggest miracle, according to Christians, would be the resurrection of Christ.
True.
But maybe according to Judaism, yeah, it depends. So it depends on the religion.
The religion.
Right.
Yeah.
So I would state that would be the big miracle. But just like how Scott stated, though, it seems that they're taking the biblical texts as, because they are older, henceforth they have some sort of validity, that the story has some sort of I don't want to use mythos, because then mythos kind of states that, okay, well, it does have falsities to it, where somebody who actually believes in the Bible believes in it fully in certain extents, at least. Not in all cases, obviously, but in certain cases, that is the way that it is. And definitely if we're talking about the resurrection of Jesus, for instance. So my question is that if we're looking at something that has a duration of time, like, let's just say the Holy Bible, the New Testament, 2,000 years, give or take, if the stories are valid with what they're trying to say, with Jesus, for instance, then we need to look at that and estimate that the story in general took close to 1,700 to maybe 1,600 years to be fully developed into what we have now, in a sense, or maybe even a longer or shorter duration of time, for instance.
Yeah, but I would probably say longer. For it to develop to what it is now, I would say it took 2022 years or 2019 years, sorry, because it's different now than it was 10 years ago.
That's true. That's true. And I find that the narrative constantly changes throughout time. Whenever there seems to be something that combats it, they try to throw up the smokescreen of something else, for instance. So beforehand, they were always trying to use science in order to validate miracles happening. But now it seems that science has pushed back relatively well against the miracles. And now they jump into philosophy, where it's like, look, philosophically, you can't say that miracles can or cannot happen. They say that it's improbable, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. And I think this is the thing that's difficult, right? Because we can say, and I think that miracles are improbable, but for me to state that, not necessarily knowing all things, I can't necessarily stand on a proper foundation on that, unless maybe.
Well, the kicker with that is it just simply depends on how you define the word miracle. If you define it as improbable, well, of course they're probable, because it's defined as
kind
something
of a
that's
tautology,
probable,
isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes.
So, but if you define it as something that's impossible yet happens because God, there's, that then you can say it's impossible, just like you said. And then you're saying, but God, then you're contradicting yourself because it just doesn't make sense at that point. And so, what it's all kind of narrowing into is the best definition of the word that makes sense. And then we can go from there and discuss,
Yeah, so that's the equivocation, because it either means, look, miracle either means something that's improbable or it means something that's impossible, but that happens. You can't have it be both, because improbable is different from impossible, right? If something is improbable, then the next question becomes, how do you tell whether it was God intervening to make the improbable probable, or whether that number just came up? That's the discussion you have to have. And you can't solve that. You're back at square one. So the better argument, at least from a Christian or religious standpoint, would be to say a miracle is something that's impossible without God intervening, because then that's the only explanation. That's the only explanation for what does happen. So then the point becomes to prove that this miracle actually did happen, rather than to have to explain what the cause of the miracle is. Was it natural or was it unnatural? You say, no, this happened. It couldn't have happened. Therefore, that's proof of God. So it depends on which camp you're in, what type of Christian. If you're the type of Christian that says a miracle is a highly improbable thing and God is the most likely explanation, to me, that's an uphill battle that you can never distinguish between the natural and unnatural causation at that point, because you've already admitted that it can happen naturally. And if you say that it's impossible, now you just have to prove that it happened.
Well, the refutation to that, to the Christian worldview on that topic, is the more pantheistic one. And so you could say that there is some part of nature that is like a God machine. It can do the same things that God does without all the properties of religious God. Just a naturalism, basically, is what explains it. But this thing is all powerful, all present. It does the same thing that your God does in order to get us to where we're at. And it's all natural. So even science understands that time space is probably not fundamental. And so they're already thinking about some other realm, like a quantum field, which does exist outside of time and space. And the Kashmir effect pretty much proves that virtual particles come from this quantum field. So from the quantum field, everything can come. So it kind of does the same operation as the God example, just without the name God to it, right? So, you're muted, Bryce.
You're muted, my man.
I was going to say, unless you call it the God particle, which was something else that they used to talk about all the time. But yeah.
Right.
I just wanted to respond really quick, because I was looking at the comments and Sophie asked the question, why do religious people argue their religion is factual when they are saved by faith, which is a belief? And I would say that is a legitimate question if by religious people you mean Christians. And even then, only certain denominations of Christianity, because many of them appeal to faith, but then you have Christians who are like presuppositional apologetics, who assert that everyone already knows that there's a God and there's clearly evidence of God, and people are just, ignoring the evidence. So they're not making appeals to faith. And there's other religions that don't necessarily, we call it faith, but like they like to argue that there's actually evidence. So, but it is a good question. Like
What's up, Sophia? Shout out.
If faith is integral to your belief, which it is for most Christians, then why even claim that there's proof or that there's evidence, right?
Right.
It's a legitimate question. I don't know the answer, by the way.
What validates a belief? Like if someone believes in a miracle, they know it's not logically impossible fundamentally, or at least you don't know whether it is or not. So what would be another form of validation a believer in miracles could make that would add up, in your opinion?
Right.
If any.
Yeah. It depends on the believer, because everyone's standard of evidence is different. Some people are convinced by finding their car keys.
That is true. That is
Yeah.
true. Some people already have the conclusion, and now
Yeah.
they're just looking for the validation for that said conclusion to begin with.
But do you know who the smartest of Jesus' disciples was? Thomas, because he was skeptical.
That is
And
true.
what did Jesus do when he was skeptical? He gave him proof. And that's the only reason why Thomas became a believer. So I reason that Thomas is the only character in the Bible who had any sense.
Absolutely, because he needed proof in order to validate if Jesus was God or the Messiah or not.
He was a weak-kneed, flag-waving, phony Christian, I guess.
But he was a disciple of Christ, right? So he was he was a Christian, and Peter was a Christian, and John were. All three of them were Christians, but their level of faith was different. So Jesus gave them the different amount of evidence that he knew would convince them. With John, I guess it didn't take any. With Peter, he had to walk on water and then fall and do all that, and then Thomas actually needed to see the holes in the hand. So yeah.
And once some other people simply chalk the Bible up to as just a big metaphorical book. I've talked to Universalist Christians that will say that basically the miracle stories are just metaphors, and they mean something. It's how it would be very superficial to believe in the comic book character Jesus, the Superman Jesus. It's more meaningful to believe in the spiritual Jesus, the philosophical Jesus, and understand that the stories were metaphors. Even the story about what happened to him was a metaphor about his life.
And that's a more difficult. That's a more difficult version of Christianity to attack, because now you're not necessarily talking to people who are making such extraordinary claims. That the less extraordinary the claim, the less argument, the less evidence you need in support of it, right? And so if you're not claiming that Jesus literally walked on water,
then it isn't the type of miracle we would even worry about. It would be your definition of miracle in this case is just a metaphor or a story. Like nobody cares,
Exactly. And I think that's where sometimes it gets really difficult to pinpoint what's going on within different Christian denominations, because with those who don't necessarily look at the Bible as being 100% correct, for instance, but look at it, let's just say allegorical or whatever the situation is, it makes it seem that then it's kind of like a teaching rather than something to follow. It's kind of like a moral reasoning of this is the story of what not to do, because here's a parable for you, in a sense, and this is why you shouldn't do it. Where if you're a literalist, then after you take everything what it is,
I think I was somewhere in between when I was a Christian. It was kind of cherry picking. There were certain things that I took literally, but a lot of it I just kind of explained away as allegory. You're missing the point. You're taking it out of context. It's not literal, and then move on. So this is before I was really challenging why I believe what I did. But there's in between too. You don't have to take the whole thing literal, and you can take some parts of it literal.
Right. And I think that's what a lot of, like, nowadays Christians within the West kind of do, right? They take the things that they think that are literal, and they kind of look at them through critical eyes, in a sense. And if it doesn't necessarily fit within their ideological field, in a sense, then they kind of like, okay, this is allegorical. This is not something that God really wanted to say, or this isn't a miracle of God. This is just like a parable telling you a story, and henceforth it's like a learning experience for those who are now reading this parable. And so,
it wasn't Jesus literally making 5,000 pieces of bread to 5,000 people. It was the fact that God is so powerful that he can make amazing things happen if you just have enough faith. Like, that's the message you're supposed to take from that, not trying to figure out the science of how he divided the bread or whether he replicated it through magic or not, because there weren't actually 5,000 people, and there may not have even been bread, So
the New Testament is a socialist handbook.
That's the
communism.
liberal. Yeah,
it's the Communist Manifesto before the Communist Manifesto.
I mean, I'm sure that there are some, hippie's not a bad word, right? That's not derogatory, right? I'm sure that there were some hippies who smoked a little something that came to that realization about the Bible and who Jesus was and what he was actually talking. He was just, I mean, you just need to love everybody, man. It's just peace and love, right?
Right.
Yeah. Well,
unless you're the other kinds of Christians that are the opposite
Yeah.
of that, the far right fascist, I'm, the kind I'm talking. The Westboro Baptist
completely,
Church.
which kind of points to me like this idea of a Roman forged document that became a religion, because the way they painted Jesus out to be, renders unto Caesar what is due to Caesar, turn the other cheek, all of these things that kind of like were pacifistic and were not threatening to authority. But then in other older manuscripts, you hear about the Jesus flipping over the tables and beating people with whips and being more strong, like a warrior, like the zealots of the first century Jewish sect, people that went in and just decimated the temple whenever they saw something out of place, and killing people,
if you're going to have a conversation about miracles, I think that the one question that always comes up for me is, if you define a miracle as something that is supernatural and not possible and only can happen with the power of God, and that's what you think miracles are, and you think miracles have happened, then the obvious question to me is, why would miracles happen? Why would God ever intervene? Is he intervening so that things go according to his will? Is he intervening because someone prayed for him to intervene, and so he's changing his plan? Was him intervening always part of the plan? And if so, why? Why doesn't he intervene all the time? Or why does he never intervene and just write a plan that went according to his plan without, why does he ever have to intervene if he knows everything and has a plan?
To get glory to himself, to glorify his name throughout the world. That's, nothing is impossible with God. Anything you ask in my name shall be granted. So it's like,
then why doesn't he do it all the time? Why isn't everything a miracle? Why aren't miracles?
Why is it wrong to ask for a miracle? I've asked Christians, like, look, if this is, you want to convince me that this thing exists, then, make lightning strike my tree at 5 o'clock 3 times in a row and write Jesus into the bark. And then they'll laugh and say, oh, you're just trying to test God. Oh, you're just trying. God is not a puppet, whatever. But that's what Jesus said. He said, ask anything.
Yeah, whatever you ask in my name, believe that it will happen and it will be done. Faith as small as a mustard seed can move mountains, right? Whenever 2 or 3 of you gather, which is a contradiction from the first thing, technically, because why does it take 2 or 3? And is it 2 or 3? But there's enough in there that says, look, this is how you one, God wants you to do it, right? You're supposed to be praying anyway, and God wants that you should ask, right? Ask and you shall receive. So what's the point of saying all that if you're going to ask and it doesn't happen?
Right.
And then what conclusion are you to draw?
God is true in either case. If he doesn't answer, it wasn't according to his will. Yeah. So God wins every time.
Yeah. It's they have it wrapped up in a nice little bow so that it doesn't matter what happens. You can just call it a miracle.
Yeah.
That's it. Exactly. And
anything could happen and it could be a miracle.
It always is.
Right.
But that's the thing, though, right? Is that no matter where you go with the miracle prospect, it always seems that there's some sort of way that they save their backs, in a sense. Is either
they don't really try to, but if you get them to define specifically what a miracle is first, let's get all the parameters of what you're calling a miracle so we can't equivocate. And then you also get them to say whether they believe it's God intervening in nature from the supernatural, like if that's how they're defining it, they believe that that happens, get them to say that in the beginning. So then the questions all become mostly about why God would do that, and did God do that? You know,
Interesting.
Well, I've heard people say that, you know, God saved my life in this automobile accident or plane crash. This person survived a horrific plane crash and all the people died except this one guy. That was a miracle. But what about all the other people that died? Like, statistically, that doesn't prove a miracle.
Yeah, and if you ask them, how do you know God?
Everyone survived.
If you ask them, how do you know God did it? They'll say, well, because of the, you know, what are the chances that I could survive? It had to be God. And you're like, well, no, that's just you were the one survivor. Everyone else died. So that's probable. You know, it's probable that there would be less survivors, and there are, and it's possible that you would survive, and you did. So how do you know that God did it? You know?
God wanted them to die, and he wanted him to be alive, you know.
Right, that one guy in the left row seat near the back, he was the one that I wanted to live. Everybody else is perfectly fine that they perish, but that one dude over there, that's the one.
Why would God
want
you or this one guy to live? You know,
it always baffled me whenever you see a natural disaster and you see the one house that's not touched, and you look, even with right now with Hurricane Fiona to just pass, and we look at the Dominican Republic, for instance, massive amounts of destruction, but there's still certain individuals whose houses haven't been touched or anything like that. And what do you predominantly hear from these individuals that didn't have any damage done to their home? Thank God it was a miracle. I can't believe that my house made it unscathed and everything like that. But look at the destruction all around that island, and you can probably think the otherwise. What would be a miracle is if the island wasn't touched. That would be a miracle.
Yeah, it would be a miracle if there was a storm or a tornado or whatever that ripped through a town without destroying anybody's house and missed every single house.
Yes, that would be a miracle.
And let me be clear, by miracle,
improbable.
By miracle, I mean something improbable, not impossible. So, yeah.
You know, because they flip-flop on it. You know, they'll say improbable one minute, and then the next minute, well, God didn't want to save all the houses. He wanted to save that one. So remember, miracles are from God always, you know.
Yeah.
So they'll flip-flop, you know.
But then I just go right back to the beginning as to then how do you know it was a miracle?
Yeah.
If you can't tell the difference between a natural thing and a supernatural thing, why call it supernatural?
Right.
That's actually, thank you for the segue. That's the actual thing that I also want to ask, is that does a miracle need to be something that is supernatural to the theist? Or is it literally based on the interpretation of improbable to impossible? And does something that is impossible, does it mean that it has to be from something that is godlike? Or could there be something else in that place making something that seems impossible, but it is only an improbable thing? Like, how do you know between
good experience with that? It kind of happens, you know, quite frequently with some people in my family, and they'll say that they'll have these very strong dreams or whatever. Like they'll dream about something that's going to happen, and they'll talk about it's going to happen, and then the thing somehow it just happens coincidentally. They do this like quite a bit. Like it's almost like a joke now. Like in my family, they'll joke about that stuff. And so these aren't really miracles, I guess, but they kind of seem miraculous to them. Like for them, from where they're sitting, from their subjective point of view, hey, you know, let's play cause and effect and pattern seeking here. You know, you've got this dream about this specific event or this specific thing, and then it happens. To them, it just seemed now a lot of times my family will just say, well, that's kind of like counting the hits and not counting the misses, you know, and they understand all that, but it still doesn't take away that weird feeling. You know how, obviously it's going to be weird, even if you say it's just coincidence, it's a weird coincidence, and that's how they kind of look at it. So I'm sure that there's people though that will see that as God talking to you.
Oh,
but
sure.
Then the question is, why is he telling me this stuff and there's nothing I can do about it? Like, what would be the point? Like, that's part of what some of my folks in my family say. It's like, I understand I get these visions, but I don't think it's anything supernatural, because what would be the point? Like, there's nothing I can do about it. Like,
yeah, and Scott, that is people who are Christian would interpret something like that as revelations from God, special revelation from God, but people who are not Christian or people from other religions, they might consider that they have the gift of psychic power. Sorry.
Yeah. Right.
So there are people who believe that they can see the future and they have premonitions, and
if that's
they're
true,
not religious,
have some scientific, it's going to have some naturalistic reason for it, if something like that. And I don't have a problem with that, but that kind of falls out of the purview of a miracle again, I guess, at least with the Christian, like you said, these things come from God, not nature, not the creation, but the creator is the one that does these things,
Yeah, but both of them are using fallacious reasoning to arrive at their conclusions.
I agree.
What happened, I think.
But but I think the problem is that because individuals, and it kind of goes back to the philosophy of things, right? Because of individuals can't comprehend that there could be something without mind interacting with everything in the universe, for instance, now there has to be that prime, well, now I'm forgetting what it's called, not prime mover, but it's the beginner, that one
metaphysical primary, the
metaphysical
primary,
exactly, yes. And from there, I think they then deduce that if this is the mind which has created everything, then most things that occur are either within its plan, or that it's able, just like how I heard a lot of times, like an author, right? An author is writing, but the author can also edit what it's writing, or what he or she is writing. And if the author is writing something and doesn't necessarily like what they put down at first, then they can erase it and put something else. But even then, I find that there's a problem with that, because it's sort of
that contradicts all knowing.
Yes, exactly.
It contradicts the the omni attributes, omniscience.
Yes.
If God knows everything, then he shouldn't be making mistakes.
That's right.
If he made a mistake and he needs to redo something, then he didn't know everything.
That's right.
So there should be no miracles.
Everything that happens falls apart.
Everything that happens should go according to his will without him having to interfere.
Right. Absolutely. Right. Because the book should already be written to begin with, and everything should be kind of determined from that moment, the start of the pages, all the way until it ends, whatever that ending is. But
now there is a caveat in Christianity, anyway, in the Bible. If you say that the purpose for a miracle is so that God can demonstrate, for people to believe, like something that bolsters faith or whatever, and that's why he's doing it to convince people, then that may have been part of his plan. But then you'd have to ask, well, why is it such a poor plan? Why wouldn't you do it more often to convince more people if you want everyone to know? Jesus even says at one point that because they ask for miracles, I will not give them. Well, what the hell sense does that kind of make? If your goal is to get more people to believe, you should do more miracles than even what they ask.
Right.
You should be doing them without them asking you, So
there's a shame attached to asking for proof, because it's sort of like making you the judge, and you're kind of looking at the other person as someone who has to prove their case.
You are the judge. And they do.
Mm-hmm.
That's the whole point that Christians
don't
understand.
But they don't want to believe that their God is to be judged by another. That's the way they'll put it, like with these precepts anyways.
Yeah.
They say you're putting God on trial. Like, who are you?
Then you've abandoned reason.
You've abandoned reason.
If you've put something higher than rationality, then rationality doesn't rule.
Exactly.
Exactly.
You can't claim to be a rational mind if you've chosen to suspend rationalism for something else, for this belief that you're asserting as a truth. And that's the problem with pre-subs. They're not rational people.
Yeah. But this is actually a good question that, I don't think that it's a question, but it's a good statement that I see in the comments section. They don't want to question the establishment. I'll put that up right now, actually. So do you think the reason why they don't want people to question miracles or anything like that is because the establishment is going to fall apart if people start questioning? Or is this something that is deeper than just the establishment in and of itself, where it actually brings people to a belief where there isn't actually that said God? And is God connected to establishment or separate from the establishment themselves? I know this is kind of going off a little bit onto like off tangent, but I do really want to ask that question.
I think when it comes to the establishment, if you're talking about like the church and church leaders and priests and pastors and all that, I think that they don't necessarily want people to ask these kind of questions. One, because they don't have the answers, and two, that they're probably afraid that their inability to answer will cause people to fall away. And so they would rather distract or talk about something else or get you to look at it in a different way and not ask the difficult questions that they can't answer, because that might weaken people's faith, and his job is to increase people's faith.
And the political establishment too. Let's not forget, especially with the right wing, they have a lot to gain by having religious, appeasing religious people. So the church will promote these ideas like, anti-evolution, whatever the topic is, abortion, whatever the case is. And so they're going to use the church, the pulpit, as a political place, or a place to exercise their political power. This is common. They do this all the time. And this is why we have separation of church and state, so that we're supposed to protect against this kind of misuse of our freedoms of religion and things like that. But
yeah, and I think just to piggyback on that, I think it also depends on which church you're talking about, because different, you have, of course, the evangelical church is everything that you just said, right? But then the Catholic Church is not necessarily conservative. They are in some ways, but like when it comes to politics and voting and stuff, they're not as conservative as the evangelicals. There's a lot of liberal Catholics, and when you look at the Black church, the Protestant Black church,
very liberal,
they tend to be liberal, and so it's a complete different interpretation of Jesus's teachings about how they should be treating other people, what they should be voting on.
Right. Good point. And that kind of like plays on both sides of the spectrum. So I get what you're saying. Like even on the Democratic side or the other political party side, there's something to appeasing church, because a lot of their base are Christians, evangelicals, or
for every person,
Black
Scott,
church, for example. What's that?
For every person that would say Donald Trump is the second coming of Jesus, there's another one that's going to say Donald Trump is the Antichrist.
Exactly. Exactly.
They're all Christians. So.
Yep. Exactly.
What you need to do.
You're absolutely.
And that's the power structure that maybe Sophia was talking about. That the establishment constitutes all those things that kind of reinforce that narrative that we should be religious, go to church, and believe in miracles and things like that.
I like Saitama's comment that,
right, yes,
Jesus may have walked on water, but Stephen Hawking can run on batteries. Yeah.
I love that statement. But
you guys know what the Jesus lizard is, right? The Basilic Jesus lizard. It runs on water. It's named that because it can it can run on water, but it's doing it according to the laws of physics.
Right.
So if I'm one of those kind of Christians, maybe, Jesus had these mutant feet and he was running really fast and appeared to be walking, and he did it for a few seconds. I don't know.
Some people say that when Jesus was in the upper room and walked through walls, it's because he was using quantum energy to shift his entanglement in order to do this Star Trek-y thing and get through the wall, you know. So
and I'm fine with that. I'm fine with the supernatural and miracles and magic being science.
Yeah.
But if you're going to make it, if that's what you're saying it is, then I have to question you. You know, I have to question your interpretation of scripture, because scripture certainly doesn't imply that. It seems to imply that the whole purpose for it being this banned thing that you're supposed to burn witches for is that it's unnatural, you know, and that it can only happen with violating the laws of physics, you know, changing staffs to snakes and such, you know. Why would it be written that way if it was actually just science?
Well, it wasn't literal, you know. He was walking through walls. In other words, he was breaking down the barriers between communication among people.
But that's the one thing too that I do want to point out, because when we, and this is what we constantly hear nowadays, is that, well, why does miracles seem to happen less nowadays, but in the past it seemed to happen all the time? It seemed like God was willing to do magical things almost in a week, you know, because if we're looking at, let's just say, Moses and the plagues, these things happened for an entire week, and God was perfectly fine with unleashing these miracles on the Egyptians. But now the thing is that technology is starting to rise and people are becoming more skeptical. Now we're seeing less miracles happen, but just like how Scott stated, they say, well, we can't critique what happened in the past because there was more believers in God in the past than there are today. And henceforth, God doesn't have the strength in order to, or God doesn't wish to show himself until there are more believers.
The hidden God.
That seems to defeat his purpose, though, because if that's what he wants, what he should be doing is doing more miracles. If he wants more believers, do more miracles. You're getting less believers because you haven't done shit.
The book even tells you,
he doesn't understand. It doesn't
the book
seem to
even
understand
tells you that. That's the whole thing about, if you ask of anything in my name, it's like the book's telling you that. Like, you can ask for miracles, anything. Yeah. I mean, I think miracle is encompassed within anything, right?
Yeah, I would think that too. And that's the question that I have, is just that for individuals who want to keep their faith, and I think that is the huge point of faith in and of itself, is for you to continue believing that there is something that can break those laws. There is something that can still, even though that we don't see it today and it's harder to see today, that the possibility is there. You know,
I think if you are appealing to faith, then you shouldn't need a single miracle. And if you need a miracle to bolster your faith, then what's the point of having faith at all? You know, like, what's the point of it if it needs miracles to keep people in it? Why don't you just give the evidence then? You know, like, why does why is faith a virtue? Isn't faith only a virtue because it can't be proven and you don't have evidence to support it? That's what makes it virtuous. The fact that you still believe in something with no evidence.
That's why Jesus told Thomas, you know, but blessed is he who believes and has not seen.
My apologies. 1 second.
Okay. Yeah, no, you were just saying, blessed are those who believe without seeing. And then also, it's impossible to please God without faith.
Right. Yep.
Right.
That pretty much says it all.
So you shouldn't need to. So then, if that's true, and God actually wrote the Bible and he was serious about wanting that all should believe, then he should never do a single miracle. And you shouldn't be calling anything a miracle, because you should be believing without seeing.
And then, you know,
that is extremely well said.
And part of the precept argument is that there can be no immutable laws of nature without a God, the Christian God. But when something's immutable, then miracles would kind of refute the immutable laws of nature argument. You know, because
what is their argument? I'm confused. They're saying that the laws of nature shouldn't be immutable, or
they're saying God set things up in a certain way. They're immutable, which means they can't be changed. They can't be anything other than how God had them set up for his own divine providence, you know.
Mhm.
And
so if he changes them,
yes, but miracles are actually God reaching in and messing with the particles in the world. So he's actually making things happen that normally wouldn't happen by the normal laws of nature.
mhm.
And this is why it's an abnormal thing, why it's a miracle. And it comes from God, according to the Christian definition. So therefore, it seems like there is no immutable argument there anymore. It seems like they've pretty much self-refuted, in my opinion.
How long does your show run, Josh?
Well, my show, I don't necessarily mind if we go a bit further
Okay.
because tomorrow is Thanksgiving, so we have tomorrow off.
I forgot you're
But
Canadian, aren't you?
yeah,
So yeah, no, I only asked because on the thing with miracles, I think that you mentioned the parting of the Red Sea earlier, Josh, and I always like to go to the flood, right? Because this is the easiest story to kind of trip Christians up. It almost doesn't matter where they land on this, they're going to have a hard time with one part of it, right? There's either evidence for the global flood or there isn't. So if you agree that there isn't, which geologists do, there's no evidence for a global flood. If you're a Christian and you agree with that, then your solution to that is it was an unnatural, supernatural thing. No, there wasn't enough water. No, it couldn't have happened like that, and things couldn't survive. And yet they did. And there's no evidence of that because that defies nature.
Well, he got the kangaroos all the way to Australia from Mount Ararat. That was
Snapped his
miracle.
finger because that's where he wanted. That's where God wanted them. He wanted them in Australia to make that land unique and beautiful in its own way.
absolutely. And I think the other issue lies as well is that when we, because as you stated, geologists do not agree in this global flood situation. However, there's a lot of creationists that will state that, look, there is evidence because look at how shellfish, and other types of fish have been pushed onto the top of mountains. How could that possibly happen if there wasn't a global flood to begin with, right? Or how could we have certain occasions where we can see certain life forms where there shouldn't be those type of life forms beforehand? There is an easy question for that, but I will allow both of you in order to tackle that.
It goes along with that story of the upright trees that you see in the strata going straight through the different layers of strata that indicate how long back in the past this earth formation was, right? Well, if you see a tree standing up between epochs of time, then that contradicts the evolutionary story. It says that, you know, the trees in all strata. But and it goes along with what you were just saying about the different life forms and this and that. And from what I understand, that sometimes earthquakes or shifts in the Earth's crust can cause the strata to move and be displaced. And this is where you get these out of time artifacts. And we know that that's what happens because in normal cases, maybe like 89-90% of the time, you're going to find strata in the same consistency. Whereas every now and again, you'll see the strata kind of misplaced and things misplaced. Well, those are situations where the earth kind of shifted due to an earthquake or something, I guess.
And the other explanation, at least for the as far as the seashells in the mountain, and this is a type of question that geologists don't ask and don't have a problem with. It's only people who haven't studied geology that would think to ask, well, why are there seashells at the top of mountains? Well, it has to do with the fact that the seashells predate the mountains. We get mountains through a process of mountain building, you know, where there's tectonic plates moving in a particular direction, and then they coalesce in a certain point, and over a period of millions of years, you know, then you get mountains. But depending on the height and the location and the speed of the movement, it would take a different amount of time. But the animal remains predate the mountain. You know, we're talking I'm sure I don't know how old the seashells are, but I'm sure if you were to date them, they would be much older than the mountain was, So of course, when it's moving along with everything and then forming a mountain, it's going to end up at the top.
Absolutely. And that's one of the reasons why that most geologists don't find this baffling or confusing or something that is miraculous whatsoever. Because
in fact, Josh, if you take a college geology course, which I did, one of the first questions the professor will ask the class is, are there any religious people in this class? That's what my professor did. And usually there's a few that raise their hand, and then the disclaimer that follows is, okay, for the purposes of this class, the earth is 4.5 billion years old, and that's the science that we're going to teach here. And I apologize if that conflicts with anybody's beliefs, but that's going to be the answer on the test. So
oh, absolutely,
there was no global flood.
Right, but that's the thing, is that there are going to be individuals, just like in any other cases, who are going to still try to validate these type of claims. They're just claims. There's no
it's for them, though.
Evidence.
Like, they need it, Josh. They're doing it for them. And I'm convinced that a lot of these apologists out there, maybe not all of them, but certainly I think a good percentage of them, the reason they do what they do isn't so much to create believers out of other people. It's to reinforce their own beliefs. Sometimes when you say something over and over again and you find new ways to reinforce the thing that you already believe, it can strengthen your faith, unfortunately.
That is true. That is definitely true. And
so with precepts in particular, I don't think any of them think that they're convincing other people with their arguments. I think that the only reason they're even having the conversation is to reinforce their own presuppositions to them.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Exactly. And KCA Randy, welcome. So
God is hiding.
Right? God is hiding. God is definitely playing hide and seek. But the question is that if there was a God, would that entail that more miracles would happen in the first place? Or is it just that God entails miracles to happen when God wishes to have miracles to happen in the first place? Because don't get me wrong, I'm not stating that miracles in and of themselves do not contradict let's just say, classical idea of what theism is. It does. But I do think that if we move away from the classical theistic idea, then technically there could be something that has the, maybe not omnis, but some sort of like best quality of memory and best quality of whatever, where there's still that possibility where it is better than us at comprehending things, but still makes those type of mistakes. But then again, could we call that God, or is that just something?
Well, I was going to say, Josh, a little while ago, you did a little bit of a false dichotomy. It was unintentional, but you said, basically it amounted to, are miracles really happening? And is it from God, or are they not? And we're calling them miracles. But there's another possibility. What if there is some sort of God and it's not the Christian God? What if it's Loki? And it's a trickster God that can do miracles. And you ask, why isn't it doing more miracles, or why is it doing any at all? Maybe it's doing just enough to confuse us, because it wants some people to kind of think that there are miracles, but it doesn't want them to really know. And it wants other people to doubt, even though there are. Maybe he's doing it for amusement. How can we rule that out?
That is very true. It's sort of like Descartes' demon at that point. It's sort of like, how do you know that you're not being manipulated by something that just wants you to believe that the circumstances that you're in at this very moment and the ideas that you have are your own, when technically it's something already.
But then, what still remains, though, is epistemic validation. So you still have a valid reason for believing things, and you have invalid reasons for believing things. Even if it's kind of like if we went to the Lost Tribe again and we showed the guy the cell phone and the pictures of, and everything that's just wooing this guy. And he goes back and he tells his people what he saw. Even though it's true, everything he said was absolutely true. He saw these things. Is it really valid for other people to believe him? I don't think so, because they're not familiar with cell phone technology, that there's even another world out there to understand things like that. And so I would say that everyone else would be valid not to believe the guy, and the guy would be valid to believe he saw what he saw. Now, they would argue, how do you know that you actually saw that and it wasn't just your imagination? For him to prove that, he would have to have some kind of prediction that he could make, like to make the hypothesis. There's these things called cell phones that do X, Y, and Z. He's going to have to make some kind of prediction that he can point to objectively, that everyone can test and repeat and observe for themselves, for it to become a valid theory, right? And so he can't do that because he has nothing to work with, and he doesn't have the tools available for him to do that. And so actually his belief is invalid in the eyes of those who, observe, who listen to the guy. They're like, we don't know anything about.
I don't mean to.
I'm done. I'm just rambling.
I don't mean to contradict you or anything. I think that because you keep using the word valid, and I think the word you probably mean is justified.
Yeah. I'm sorry. You're right. Justified, valid.
I didn't want to confuse the audience.
And everything. Yeah, it would.
Because there's probably people saying like, "What? How is it not valid?"
Right.
But yeah. So, but it wouldn't be justified based on
the
evidence.
So what he had seen was valid.
Because it would be valid,
exactly. Not justified to the other individuals who he's telling at that very moment. Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And I think that when we're really looking at something, I think that it's kind of like the Humean way of looking at things in a sense. It's more or less that you're like, okay, well, what is a possibility of a miracle happening? Because it's so improbable to almost impossible that it's happening. And henceforth, should we even give credence to the individual who comes forward and says that this has happened in the first place, right? Is that, how can I say this? Is that the right way of dealing with individuals coming with us with these miraculous type of stories, right? How do we know the statement that the individual is making has any justification in the belief if they even did see it? And even if, let's just say, the individual was able to bring you to the area, you yourself are bamboozled by the miraculous event that is occurring just before you. Does that mean that the event is from something that is of a higher power, or are we just not understanding what we're looking at?
Yeah, it's the same situation that I was referring to my family members. They would just say, I don't know what it is, but it's weird. It is very strange, but I don't know. By definition, I couldn't say it was God or whatever. Aliens, time travelers, matrix glitches.
Right.
I mean, the list can go on and on and on,
I always like to boil it down to psychology. And, for me, it has to do with the person's method of reasoning, and so the question for me becomes, why do people reason the way that they do? Why do some people believe without reasoning like we just did? And it's because some people don't know how to reason. Some people are willing to accept that as perfectly credible evidence when really they shouldn't,
Right.
And so, like, oh, a cell phone, lets you talk to people far away. I've never seen anything. We don't have anything like this, but that makes perfect. Oh, and it has pictures on it and images of real life. If you just believe that with no concept or understanding about how that could be possible, you are irrational, even if the thing that you're believing is true.
Yep.
Right. I would completely agree with that. And I think, too, in order for something, because again, there can be not just one person, but a group of people who are who believe or I don't even think we can put that into the realm of belief, though, if it's a validated thing that they've seen. It would be more or less that the individuals then go out in order to explain what they have seen to other individuals. And I think from there, because you're not seeing it firsthand, now you're seeing it from secondhand witnesses, in a sense. You're not witnessing the event yourself. And I think that's where the issue comes down. And
yeah, that's what I mean about, like, you should not be willing to believe a story that someone else told of an extraordinary thing without extraordinary evidence. That is unreasonable. The other person might be justified to believe what they've seen with their own eyes, but you're not justified to believe what they say they've seen with their own eyes.
Now, here's the contradiction. Many Christians I talk to, we might get into these debates, and they'll point to the miracles in the Bible or the miracles Jesus performed or whatever. And you'll mention Sai Baba. Like, I could mention Sai Baba, who had not just 5,000 witnesses, but he's got like millions of followers and hundreds of thousands of people who testified to seeing him raise people from the dead, do walk on water. He's done all these things that, Jesus did, apparently. And they don't believe him that. They're like, oh, that's just crazy talk from Sai Baba followers. Like, these are actual witnesses that are still alive today, that we know their names. We can trace them really easy. Sai Baba died in the 80s or whatever. So, but yet you don't believe that, but yet you believe a document 2,000 years ago.
Well, they're missing the point, Scott.
It wasn't even written by the eyewitnesses. This is written about the eyewitnesses concerning what they say.
They're missing the point, Scott, because the point that you're trying to make is, look, we have better evidence for this other belief, for these claims than we do for the ones you're having. They see it as the claims that I'm convinced of, I've already been indoctrinated into that, and that tells me that these other things are false. So they're not going to believe the things that, even though they have more evidence for them, because they've already locked themselves into the first thing that they were convinced by. Most people who are religious are in their first religion.
Yeah.
Sometimes people convert to different religions, but that's the minority. Most people, whatever religion they're in, it's the one that they started in, because it's difficult to become unindoctrinated and then indoctrinated into something that contradicts that. Very difficult.
For them, I've talked to them, and for them, they sort of look like, even if what you're saying is true, now I have to somehow explain all the miracles of the Bible and how that happened, and how does that fit with my worldview, because those things are supposed to be from the devil in my worldview.
Well, the mistake, though, Scott, is the point is not to convince them that the new one is true. It's to convince them that there's more evidence for the new one.
Exactly.
But you're still not justified to believe that either.
Exactly.
The point is, you are not justified to use this method to come to a belief. Because it can lead you to this, it could lead you to that, it could lead you to this. None of them have sufficient evidence to warrant belief. And yet many more people believe in this thing with more evidence than what you have. So if they're not justified, you're really not justified. Yeah. That's the point that we're trying to get to them. But they see it as, no, I believe this more than that. And it's
but it's very interesting to see the psychology of individuals that have been indoctrinated into something, because most of the time they already believe that they have the right thing to begin with. They already have the key, they have the solution. And by then, why should I even believe in the other opinion?
And this is most religious people, John. This was me when I was religious.
Likewise with me too.
It's because we didn't know how to reason yet. We didn't know what reasoning was. We probably hadn't learned much philosophy. I don't know if we've taken critical thinking at that point, but just learn basic argumentation. Critical thinking and argumentation should be taught in high school, but most people are never taught it. Most people are taught religion from childhood. So years and years of that, if you never learn critical thinking, if you never learn how to evaluate arguments and how to examine evidence,
don't question authority.
Yeah, especially if you're in a religion that tells you that faith is a virtue. You're not supposed to question. People who question are weak in faith. If you're building faith up to be this thing, questions are bad. Skepticism is bad. Skepticism is the beginning of critical thinking. But if your religion tells you that people are blessed without seeing, well, that's a suspension of skepticism.
Yeah, the fear of God is the end of it.
Fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, it says.
Yeah,
Fear
right.
of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Well,
Mhm.
if you accept that first, then you can't apply skepticism, especially if you think you're not supposed to test God and you're supposed to believe without questioning, you know. So it depends on the severity of the indoctrination. But if it's with those particular beliefs, even if someone sits you down and says, "Hey, take this course in critical thinking," you're going to be it's going to be a difficult class for you.
It's
Oh,
all like it's cultish. It's cultish sort of mentality in a way, you know.
Religion
It's
you're talking about, right?
religion,
Not
yeah. It's
critical
like
thinking.
just indoctrination, fear, not allowing you to go out and look at contrary evidence, not to question. Those are the hallmarks of a cult, you know. And
There's
so
so
it's,
many cults out there. It's so easy to get into a cult. Like the three of us probably consider ourselves reasonably intelligent people who question and value skepticism and all that. And I'm sure that we are, but it is so easy, just human psychology. It's very easy for us to get into a cult. You know, if you're exposed to it, if you are exposed to certain things, if you, has anyone ever been to an AA meeting?
Yes.
Even just to investigate to see what it was about, or because you
I know about it, but I haven't been there.
Like I
to
haven't
one.
been there because of anything. For me, it's more investigation. I wanted to see exactly what the circumstances.
Well, if you've never been in an AA meeting before and someone invites you to go along and you sit in on your first meeting, you would think that it's a cult.
Yeah.
It's very similar, the way that it's the organization of it, even what the inside of it looks like, and how the people have discussion, the way they arrange the chairs, the way that they begin with the serenity prayer
Yes.
and end with a prayer, you know. So it is, but it's definitely about surrendering to something. Do
you think that's more prevalent today with the online communities and echo chambers, and especially, like, you could say religion, politics, movements? All of these things are sort of formed online, and people get into these echo chambers and they sort of have these, I don't know if those are the same thing as cults. Cults are a little more
more organized, I would say.
More organized, yeah.
Yeah.
But that core thinking, there's something about this climate that kind of appeals to that sort of tribalistic nature.
But I think
sorry, go ahead, Josh.
No. It's cool. I think that the problem is that certain people feel alone in a world that's so fast today. You know, everything is happening at such fast speeds. People are more on Twitter and Facebook and everything like that rather than meeting each other. And I think that even at the end of the day, the problem is that people miss the human to human interaction. So anybody who is able to delve into that, or if there's something that can be out there for you, that then you can enter into and feel like you're a part of something greater than yourself, in a sense.
It's for people who need fellowship.
Exactly.
Yeah. Those are the type of people who get caught up in cults and join new religions or new wave movements or whatever. People who need to convene with other people for them to give themselves some sort of happiness, and it can revolve around an idea. It could be about healing crystals, or, you know, what's the stuff, the herbal movement? What's that movement where everybody's
Herbalife,
like,
or
anything like that. It could be over that, you know, and that becomes their religion, you know. But it's really, people just need to fellowship with their fellow man. That's what builds them up.
You know, what you're saying is absolutely correct. And then also, because kind of what Josh was alluding to, we've sort of stopped knowing how the skill of talking to people in person. And I think what's happened is the way we speak to each other now has changed to where things we wouldn't say to people to their face in person, they will gladly be keyboard warriors and tear the other side down, sling mud, say all kinds of things. And now that has been the mode of communication, unfortunately, especially among people that are part of these different groups. Like, you get a person who's in a religious group versus an atheist group. They're always going to be slinging mud at each other, ad hom attacks, being trollish.
Well, most people, a lot of people who argue are trying to online are trying to, they're just trying to win.
Yeah.
And I'm not, I'm trying to find the best arguments, whether it's mine or somebody else's. And so, if you're going to say that if your claim is that you're rationally justified to believe that miracles happen, well, then let's have a conversation about that to see if that's true. Because if miracles actually do happen, well, then shit, I want to believe in them too. Like, I have a couple of requests. But if they're not,
I'm for it 100%.
But if they're not, why are we wasting our time with this? And maybe we should be thinking about reality in a more realistic way. That's kind of exactly realistic, but you know what I'm trying to say.
No, I get what you're saying. And I think that when it all comes down to it, everybody wants to have some sort of, because I even think if you ask like an atheist and say, well, if miracles did exist, wouldn't you want to pray to the thing that can grant those miracles? And predominantly, I think everybody has something that they wish to ask for.
It would depend, because who's to say it's not like that movie, The Wishmaster, where you ask for something and then it comes true in a way that you didn't want, or there's some price to pay for somebody else, like
that's true. If that's
the situation, then no, I don't.
No, of course. But I mean, I think that the only way to find out if it was like the Wishmaster, for instance, right, would be to see other individuals going through something, or you being the first individual that goes through something that you thought it was going to be A, B, and C, but you're seeing E, F, and G type of thing happening. And you're like, wow, this wasn't what I expected whatsoever. And I think this is the thing that really... Oh, so go ahead. It seems like it...
Well, I want to say that if someone prays for their cancer to go away and it goes away, I'm not impressed. And the person who has cancer shouldn't be either. If the person has a missing leg and they pray for a new leg to grow, then they should be impressed. Maybe we can call that a miracle, because that's beyond biology. That's beyond medical science, and that's beyond the current paradigm. We know that never has happened, or at least we have no reason to believe that that's ever happened. And we know that cancer goes into remission all the time in rats. So were the rats praying to God too? And what about the rats that didn't pray, right? So don't give me something that can happen naturally to claim that it was a miracle. Give me something that can't happen according to any natural means, and then let's see that prove that actually happened. That would be impressive to me. That would be a start to the conversation of whether or not there are miracles. Not the conclusion. It's just the start.
Right. And I think that's the whole entire point to kind of put on the table, is that until there is some sort of some sort of justification and validation of these supposed miracles able to happen, I think that what people should start doing is still dealing with the real world, in a sense, and not trying to pray for something and hoping that that particular prayer, which then becomes a miracle, for instance, for certain individuals, right, or they believe will become a miracle, doesn't happen. Because I think too that human beings are extremely optimistic, but sometimes to their detriment, I think. And
anything's possible in the magic kingdom
can be greatly damaging when you realize that the thing that you thought you weren't going to have is going to be the thing to take you out.
Yeah. And, Titan Uranus just left a comment about the regrowing of limbs thing. And that's why I wanted to emphasize the last part of that, because there are certain species that can regrow limbs, but humans are not one of them. Is the thing. And as far as we know, many lizards have regrown tails, but no humans have ever regrown an amputated leg, right? And so I want to see that if someone's claiming that a miracle happened, I want to see something like that. And then we can test it and investigate to see whether this could have, maybe this is something new that we didn't know about science before. Does that need to be added? Does this have an explanation? And if it does it necessarily mean the Christian God? Maybe it was aliens. Maybe it was other dimensional beings with advanced technology. It doesn't mean that the supernatural is real necessarily because someone's leg grows back. And it certainly doesn't mean that the Christian God is the answer, but we can't even get there because no one's leg has ever grown back. I guess that was the point I was trying to make.
Yeah.
We only ever get people
at
talking about
CRISPR
finding their car keys or curing, cancer going into remission or something like that.
Maybe the good people at CRISPR can make that miracle happen when they fuse those lizard genes into humans, and we can start growing stuff.
Right.
But then it wouldn't be a miracle at that point again.
No, then it's just science.
That's it, exactly. And I think what most people mean, because whenever I hear people talk about miracles, I think they talk more about the improbable rather than the impossible.
Mhm.
And I think
Which to me makes it useless. Like, why call that a miracle?
I agree.
Like, why not just call it something improbable?
You're right, but I think that because it's either improbable or what people like to say so improbable or whatever, which doesn't really change anything because improbable is improbable no matter what kind of
and they're both possible.
Exactly.
That's the problem. Those things are both naturally possible. It doesn't matter how improbable it is, it's still possible. So you have to eliminate what's possible but first, and according to the laws of nature, before you call something supernatural. Right.
That is correct.
So you have to eliminate it from possibility and then say it still happened in order for miracle to have any usefulness and conversation to even test, like that's the first test. Is it possible? If it's possible, it's not a miracle.
I completely agree. And I think in the long run, that is what individuals need to start looking at is what kind of terminology are you hearing before you hear miracle? If it's improbable, then there, as you stated, there is still a possibility, no matter how slim that possibility is. And if it's what people say, it's impossible to happen, now that is something where we need to go down a line of questioning and say, well, how did we come to that statement? Right?
Yeah.
How did we come about that something was impossible to happen with the knowledge that we have right now?
I think you guys are both right, and that one of the reasons why there's still so many religious people in this day and age, despite our technology, our level of scientific competency, most of us, people still believe in this sort of thing, is because most people are defining miracle as what you said, something that's highly improbable. So they're defining it that way, and they haven't learned through critical thinking that highly improbable means possible. And you have to eliminate the impossible in order to be justified in concluding that it was supernatural.
Absolutely.
They haven't learned that part yet,
Yeah, you hit the nail right on the head. But we're getting up to the 1 hour and 30 mark, so I don't want to keep you guys up any later than you have to. I do really appreciate that you guys came on through and really gave such a great conversation. I loved this entire conversation from beginning to end. So thank you both for coming on. It's great to have you, and it was an awesome pleasure.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. I'm always happy to come on your show and really anyone else who has me. I've been persona non grata lately because I'm going through a lot of things right now, and I'm going to be moving, so I haven't done this in a long time, but this was fun for sure.
It was really fun, and I'm grateful for having both of you on the show. Is there any last words that you want to state, both of you, before we close the show down?
Not for me, not really. Just thanks for having me, man. I appreciate coming on the show and having the conversation. It's always fun, and haven't talked to Bryce in a while, so it's nice catching up and talking about these things again.
Yeah,
I'm glad to be missed.
Yep.
Indeed. It's good sometimes to bring the old gang back together again in order to have some conversations and stuff, because it's brings back the old times.
Yeah. Really I'm happy to come back. Just let me know.
Yeah. Absolutely. Now, thank you both for coming on again. It was an amazing conversation, and I love having both of you on. So next time, we will be talking about another subject matter, which is going to be great. Not sure what that is yet, but it is on its way.
It'll be epic.
That's right. Also, for anybody who's preparing for next week, we're having a show based on women in the Bible. And we're going to actually have Deborah Grace. We're going to have Godless Granny. And we're also going to have, I believe her name is Jenna again. We had her on the show beforehand. Actually, we had her on this show based on Roe v. Wade. And she's
Jenna Miu?
No, not Jenna Miu. It's
Jenna
actually, I think it's Laura.
Laura.
I think
Laura McGee?
Not Laura McGee, another Laura.
Okay, we know too many people with the same name.
That's right. But Laura is going to make another comeback, and we're going to have a really good panel discussion about women in the Bible. So if you want to come on through, please. Saturday, same time. Actually, 8. Saturday at 8 p.m. EST. That's what we're going to be talking about. But for everybody who's on here, have a great night. Thank you for watching. And until next time, this is Josh the Archon calling out. Later, everybody.